We're in 2 Samuel chapter 18 this morning, and we're finally getting to Absalom's downfall. He's had it coming for a few chapters. 2 Samuel chapter 18, and we addressed a couple of questions from the booklet last time. I realize I haven't actually asked this in a while, but I hope that the booklets are a helpful study guide in some way, at least getting us to think through the text that we gave out at the beginning. Now maybe it's again not required reading, but it is something that we're using and following along in the class. And sometimes when I ask the questions that might seem a little, how are we going to know that off the top of our head? It's because they were in the workbook. But anyhow, that's just a suggestion to consider. Maybe they're not particularly great questions because but that's the fault of the guy who wrote them. So, but in 2 Samuel chapter 18, David is mustering his men for battle, and Absalom is camped at one place, and David is camped at Mahanaim. And in verses 1 through 5, we noted last time David chooses 3 military commanders. One of them is Joab, who we expect. One of them is Abishai, who we expect. One of them is Ittai, who it sounds a little strange at first glance because he's a Philistine, and perhaps it shows how short-handed David really is and that he's going to a foreigner to lead a third of his army. Now granted, Ittai has proven himself loyal to David and stood with him when he didn't have to, when others were deserting him. David wants to go fight in battle, and his men refuse to let him go. In verse 2, David says, "I myself will surely go out with you also." But in verse 3, the people said, "You should not go out, for if we indeed flee, they will not care about us. Even if half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore now it is better that you be ready to help us from the city." They could suffer 50% casualties, and it wouldn't be as bad as losing King David. And of course, this is quite distinct from Absalom. Back in chapter 17, when Hushai and Ahithophel were having their dispute before Absalom, Ahithophel's suggestion was that Absalom stay out of it. Ahithophel would get his band of men together, and they would go out, they would hunt David down, they would kill David, leave everybody else alive, and the kingdom would be united under Absalom. But Hushai suggested a different strategy, which, although it was more grandiose, was also a bad political move on Absalom's part. He said, "No, Absalom, you should get everybody gathered together, and you should all pursue David, and you should engage his entire army and kill everybody who supported him, and you yourself will personally go into battle." And so Absalom gets to be the knight in shining armor on the horse, his hair blowing in the wind, or however that works out, and he's going to go into battle, and he's going to defeat David personally, and he'll get all the glory and all the splendor. Well, of course, Absalom apparently views war more as a media publicity piece than a functional tool, and so he goes with Hushai's advice, which ultimately had been ordained of the Lord to thwart the counsel of Ahithophel. But David is contrasted with Absalom here, as David is not going into battle because of the risk to himself. Absalom is going into battle personally, and it winds up to cost him, because Absalom ends up dead. His presence on the battlefield costs him dearly. David says something else too, and we didn't really get into this last time. In verse 5, the king charged Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." And all the people heard when the king charged all the commanders concerning Absalom. All right, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom, which basically means don't kill him, take him alive. And everybody hears it. The commanders hear it, and the soldiers hear it. And what can we say about this? Is David's request not to harm Absalom, is that a realistic request in light of what is about to happen? It's a wish, certainly. Is it realistic? Well, why not? He's his enemy.
They're in the middle of a fight. They're in the middle of a fight. The other guy's trying to kill you. It's hard not to defend yourself without killing him.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is a battle. Battles usually end up dead. Now, why would David say something like this? Love. No. I mean, there's an emphasis here on the willingness to spare and forgive. Even after all this disaster has taken place, even after all the bad things Absalom has done, even after he's made himself odious to his father by going into his concubines, well, David still wants to get some kind of reconciliation. I mean, now, David's request isn't realistic because, Absalom's going to war. He's not going to therapy. This isn't, what war inevitably kills people. And, secondly, of course, you've got the fact that Absalom would not have extended the same grace to David. The entire reason this war is even being fought is so that they can kill David. And, here David's saying, oh, don't kill Absalom. That would be bad. And thirdly, does Absalom deserve death? At this point. Well, God seemed to think so. In chapter 17 and verse 14, the Lord had ordained to thwart the good counsel of Ahithophel so that the Lord might bring calamity on Absalom. Now, here's the real kicker. You keep reading in the story, by a series of completely coincidental circumstances, and I don't think they're really coincidental, Absalom is actually placed in a position where he could be taken alive, and thus giving David the fulfillment to his unrealistic request. So that's what gets interesting about this. David's request here actually could have been fulfilled were it not for Joab. We're going to see that as we go throughout. All right, let's read about the battle itself. And I guess verses 6 through 15. Well, no, verses 6 through 18. Somebody read verses 6 through 18. That's the battle account here.
Battle took place of Israel. Battle there was better. Absalom happened. Riding on the otherwise by then Joab said, I will not waste I was time carried down
All right. First of all, you'll notice, how does this battle go? An overall picture of the battle doesn't get a lot of description. You only really describe it in about 3 verses, in verses 6 through 8. How would you characterize it? It was a victory for David, right? Okay. Why did David? Well, how did David win this battle? A lot of people got lost in the forest. The forest ate more people than the sword did that day. What's significant about that? The forest killed more people than the sword. I mean, we don't know how. Were they tripping over rocks? Were they running into trees? Were they impaling themselves on stakes? I don't know.
Right.
There you go. Yes, he's quoting his Tolkien. Just remember that, right? Well, probably the other way around. You know, Tolkien was a well-established Bible scholar in addition to other things, but no. What else was? What's significant about that? The fact that the forest devours more than the sword. Exactly. You know, that's not coincidence. That's the Lord acting, is what it is. You know, all of the elements defeat them. Just like, you know, huge boulders rain from the sky in Canaanite battles, or the sun standing still, or any number of other things, people being thrown into confusion. Well, it's the Lord intervening in battle, like He always does. You know, the Lord is the one who decides how this battle is going to go, ultimately. And it's a disaster for Absalom. The battle was spread over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. Oh. Well, now let's get to Absalom's hairy situation. I did not come up with that joke myself. It's a real punishment here. He gets into this. He gets into this situation. We have the forest devours his army, and from verse 9 onward, we have a specific example of how the forest devours Absalom. Right, and he's riding a mule. The mule was the royal animal of the time. And suddenly he has that mule yanked out from under him because he gets his head caught in a tree. Okay. And now he's stuck hanging between heaven and earth. Now he's losing the mule. If the mule is the royal animal, there's a symbolism there that losing the mule is equivalent with him losing the kingdom. Now, his hair was his defining feature. Remember back in chapter 14, verses 25 through 27? Well, that defining feature of his has now become his undoing. Gotta love the poetic justice here. And one of Joab's lieutenants sees Absalom hanging from the tree. And by the way, that language of hanging from a tree, anything that would remind us of? Okay, yeah, well that points us forward, certainly. Is there anything backwards it might remind us of? What do the laws say about that? We'll talk about the potential Jesus connection in a minute, but I'm sorry? Cursed is the man who hangs on a tree. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. If a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is to be put to death, you hang him on a tree. His corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day. For he who is hanged is cursed of God, so that you do not defile your land, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. He who hangs on a tree is cursed by God. Now this is kind of a running theme throughout the Old Testament narratives. Canaanite kings are hung on trees. Absalom is hung on a tree. And you get later on in the story of Esther. How many times is that story, is Haman described as being hung on, well, gallows in that instance, but still, being hung is a symbol of being accursed. Now, you see that. They see Absalom hanging from the tree, cursed by God. Joab offers to pay the man, I would have paid you 10 pieces of silver to kill him. Why don't you kill Absalom? Well, this unnamed soldier, he gives what's his reason for not killing Absalom?
Don't raise your hand against the son. He said, if I had done this, you would have blamed it all on me and it's still loose.
Yeah.
Then you do it yourself.
Yeah, Joab, you wouldn't reward me for this. You wouldn't protect me from the king's wrath. No, you're just trying to shield yourself. You would have stood aloof. But it's interesting here, again, the perfect opportunity has presented itself to actually fulfill David's really outlandish instruction, and it doesn't happen. The soldier's not going to be party to incurring the king's wrath. Joab, he defies David. He stabs Absalom in the heart with 3 spears. Well, clearly he's took his field being burned a little hard. Yes? I'm sorry? I don't know what happened. Maybe all his weapons fell off him when he got caught in the tree, or I don't understand exactly how he could, be in this situation. Maybe he's unconscious for all we know. It's funny, Absalom never says anything in the story. That's something that I thought is interesting. For whatever reason, the man who attained his power by smooth talk and smooth flattery, here, he's completely mute. Now, whether he's, unable to speak, or whether the narrator has silenced him by the way the story is being told, I don't know. It was interesting, it's the central concern of the text is David's concern with Absalom. And Absalom never speaks. He has been silenced by the narrator. Joab stabs Absalom with 3 spears in the heart. Absalom, I guess, if he attempts to defend himself here, whatever reason, it probably is pretty feeble. I mean, you're hanging from your head in the tree. How mobile do you think you're going to be in that situation, ultimately? Joab has a decisive advantage there, too. He stabs him with 3 spears in the heart. He has his own armor bearers actually kill Absalom, because apparently the spears didn't do the job, in verse 15. And then Joab ends the pursuit, because the battle is over when the rival king is killed. Isn't that kind of what Ahithophel suggested they do? You only need to kill one person to end this conflict. And Joab seems to think the same thing. Absalom's dead. Battle's over. No more fighting. Well, of course, this is different from Absalom's battle plan he got from Hushai. Joab recognizes there's a diplomatic necessity of reassimilating his allies. Only the rival king needs to die. You find the same philosophy later in chapter 20, whenever Sheba has his rebellion. And Joab chases him to the north into a city. And Joab says, we don't have to destroy the city. We really only need one guy who's hiding in your city. And the city surrenders Sheba's head by throwing it over the wall. That's in chapter 20 as well. Then Absalom is thrown into a pit, buried under a pile of rocks. Does that remind us of anything? Any previous Bible stories?
Joseph did rock.
Okay, that's true. Okay.
Achan, ruler of Israel, Jericho, or at Jericho, Ai was taken down into the valley that is later named after the valley of Achor, raised up over him.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point to bring out. Achan is certainly one example of that. Absalom is not buried in the family tomb. He gets a dishonorable burial. And instead, he's buried in the forest under a heap of rocks. And his burial, resembles that of Achan and also of some of the Canaanite kings. It's the same thing when they capture Ai and when they defeat the 5 kings in Joshua 10. They capture those kings and they hang them on trees first, and they bury them under a huge pile of rocks. The same sequence of events takes place with Absalom. He hangs from a tree, then he's buried under a pile of rocks. Absalom is treated very much like the Canaanite kings. Which I guess is appropriate since he was half Canaanite. Interestingly, again, we already noted he never speaks. Verse 18 gives his one legacy as king, a monument, literally called the Hand of Absalom in verse 18. Now, the fact that he had to build his own monument testifies to his ego problem, I guess. He says, I have no son to preserve my name, which appears to contradict what's said in chapter 14 and verse 27, where he had 2 sons and a daughter. There's a couple ways we can reconcile that. Maybe his sons died. Maybe he built the monument before having children, because the story is not necessarily told in chronological order. Maybe Absalom is oblivious to the fact he has sons. I don't know. We have no definite way of reconciling that. We only have possibilities, ultimately. His sons would have had to be pretty young, though.
Here again, the story is not told.
Well, no, the story is not told in chronological order. It would have been pretty difficult for that to happen, because Absalom would have been born during David's reign. You do the math. Even if we push this right up to the end of his reign, Absalom would have had to have been maybe 40 years old or something like that, but that's unlikely in and of itself. And then on top of that, we have, of course, his son would have to be born and grow up in the process of that. It seems a little odd, but there's more than one way to reconcile it, and I don't think we should get too discombobulated by whether or not Absalom had sons. Now, I want to backtrack to something that got said earlier, because it comes up sometimes. Some people have seen this, and this idea of Absalom hanging from a tree as a subtle way of foreshadowing Jesus. Now, some people think that that's going too far, and that's reading too much into the text. And other people, not so much. Let's ask that question. Is there any substance to that view, or does that interpretation go too far in seeing Jesus in the Old Testament?
I think in the fact that Deuteronomy curses everyone free, Absalom is obviously hurt for hanging on.
Okay.
Jesus took all of our sins, guilt of all of our sins upon himself, hung on the tree. There is a sense, perhaps, there's a similarity, okay? Whether this is a foreshadowing that was intended by God to be such.
Okay. All right. That's good. Certainly that Galatians 3 has the idea of Jesus becoming a curse for us. Anybody else have thoughts on this? Well, the similarities don't just stop at hanging on a tree. That's one thing we need to know as well. Absalom what's his relationship to David? He's David's son, right? What about Jesus? What's his relationship to David? Yeah. He's called a son of David in certain texts, like in Romans chapter 1, for instance. All right. Absalom dies hanging from a tree. Jesus dies hanging from a tree. And technically a cross, but the New Testament frequently uses the word for tree to describe the thing that Jesus died on. And sometimes translations obscure that, but that's mentioned quite a few times in the New Testament, like in 1 Peter 2 or in Acts chapter 4, for instance. And in Galatians 3, of course, makes that connection explicit. Absalom, stabbed in the heart with a spear. Well, what did they do after Jesus died on the cross? They stabbed him with a spear, right? Yeah. And Absalom, buried and covered with stones. Where was Jesus buried? Buried in a tomb, giant stone rolled over the door. And, of course, we're going to continue reading that, and this is where it gets really interesting. As we move on into the text, these messengers start running to David to report the death of Absalom, and David keeps reassuring himself of one thing. Surely this messenger is bringing good news. The death of a king in a tree is good news. Well, that's a little odd, certainly, but that idea gets new substance in the New Testament when our king dies on a tree, but that is the good news as well. Now, of course, David doesn't take it as good news, but it is good news for him nonetheless. Now, are Absalom and Jesus alike in every respect? No. How are they different? Okay, Absalom had sins. There's that big one. Yeah.
Traitor.
He was a traitor to his father. As opposed to Jesus, what was he doing with his father? He was obedient to his father. Right. Okay, what else? Okay, Jesus was a son of God. And there's, you get a couple of other things going on here too. Absalom died because he seized the throne. He wanted more power for himself. Jesus died because he left the throne. He left the throne of heaven. He didn't regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, according to Philippians chapter 2. And there's another thing that comes out later on as we keep reading. When David learns the news of Absalom's death, he says something that's kind of interesting. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." David wishes that he could have died in Absalom's place. Well, the reverse is true of Jesus. Jesus dies in our place. That Jesus is the one who substitutes for us, who takes on the curse that was reserved for us. The Christ became a curse for us, Galatians chapter 3 teaches. So, now, of course, is this reading too much into an Old Testament passage? Well, it's really not out of line with some of the more elastic uses you see of the Old Testament and the New Testament, like Abraham sacrificing Isaac, or turning the Hagar-Sarah story into allegory to symbolize the two covenants, or Paul's own use of Deuteronomy 22 and Galatians 3 for that matter. Maybe it's just me, but I had a conversation with somebody recently where I was kind of accused of reading too much of Jesus into the Old Testament. And I said, well, if I'm pre-programmed to see Jesus everywhere in the Old Testament, it's only because Jesus saw himself there first. Luke chapter 24. Everything that is written about me in the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. These things happen so that might be fulfilled. Luke 24, verse 44. Now, any list of Old Testament passages about Jesus is too short if it does not include the entire Old Testament. That's just what we need to consider. The early Christians saw Jesus as the fulfillment of all of this in some way. Sometimes it's a contrast and sometimes it's a comparison. But Absalom, what is Absalom? He's like an anti-anointed one. He's like an anti-Christ figure, to borrow another term from the New Testament. Yeah, the man who would be king versus the man who really was king. Absalom is fighting against the Lord's anointed. He is against the Lord's Christ. That makes him an anti-Christ by definition. That's what the word means. He's a wicked man who gets what he deserves, and represents what we all deserve ultimately in hanging on a tree. But Jesus puts himself in his place, and thus in our place, takes on that curse for us, and ultimately, gives us hope by that comparison. Keith, you have something?
All things work good. Love the Lord. All. All things. Just as the Lord controls the atmosphere, every aspect of our existence, orchestrated this.
Yeah. Yes. All things work together for good for those who love the Lord. But for those who don't love the Lord, all things don't work together for good so far. That's a good point to bring out here. Exactly. That's a good thing to realize is, when you hear people throw that verse around all the time, all things work together for good to those who love the Lord. Make sure you love the Lord. Because otherwise not all things are going to work together for good for you. Of course, this brings us to another issue that comes up in the latter segment here, where David is lamenting over the death of Absalom. And he's upset because Absalom's dead. But David's perspective there isn't really realistic either. Even though it's, a father grieving his son, that makes sense. We can sympathize with that to some level. But on the other hand, you cannot pray for the deliverance of the righteous unless you are willing to accept that some people really aren't going to make it. Unless you are willing to accept that the wicked are likewise to receive judgment. Because praying for one implicitly prays for the other. Now you read Psalm 3. What is Psalm 3 is said to be in the context of Absalom's revolt. And what does David say in that psalm? He says, "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you have smitten all my enemies on the cheek. You have shattered the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be upon your people." And David prayed that. And if we are to take the headings seriously, when he fled, this was written when he fled from Absalom. Does he expect Absalom's teeth to get shattered in this psalm? That's a tough thing to deal with. And yet here we find out in subsequent verses when David laments over his son that there is some difficulty dealing with that. All right, let's... it's hard to find a good break in this section, and the chapter division is not good here. We'll just go ahead and pick up with the running. And verse 19, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Please let me run and bring the king news that the Lord has freed him from the hand of his enemies." Joab said to him, "You're not the man to carry this news today, but you shall carry news another day. However, you shall carry no news today, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to the Cushite, "Go tell the king what you've seen." And so the Cushite bowed to Joab and ran. Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said once more to Joab, "But whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite." And Joab said, "Well, why would you run, my son, since you will have no reward for going?" "Whatever happens," he said, "I will run." So he said to him, "Run." Ahimaaz ran by way of plain and passed up the Cushite. That's kind of interesting here. Joab won't send Ahimaaz, who's mentioned by name, but he sends this foreigner, this Ethiopian, to report the same news. Ahimaaz is the one who doesn't tell David that Absalom is dead, and the Ethiopian does. Now, Joab is puzzled by his insistence to keep running. You know, you're not going to get a reward for going, but Ahimaaz really likes to run, apparently. He's the forerunner of a time when people run for fun. Imagine that. Ahimaaz outruns the Ethiopian by taking a shortcut. In verse 24, David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall and raised his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was running by himself. And the watchman called and told the king. The king said, "If he's by himself, there's good news in his mouth." He came nearer and nearer. And then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "Behold, another man running by himself." And the king said, "This one is also bringing good news." And the watchman said, "I think the running of the first one is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "This is a good man. He comes with good news." You notice David has a favorite word today. What is it? Good, well, really good news, I guess, is two words. But yeah, gospel, euangelion. Although this would have been in Hebrew originally. Watchman sees a man running by himself. Well, if he's by himself, that's good. Well, what would you expect if it was bad? Probably expect everybody. Wishful thinking. Aha, okay. You know, David keeps telling himself these messengers are bringing good news. In verse 31, the Ethiopian claims, "I'm bringing good news." Well, what's David expecting? What's his idea? What does David think good news is? We defeated your enemies and saved Absalom. Hey, guess what, David? Guess what, David? You got to eat your cake and have it. It doesn't really work that way. He wants to win the battle, but he wants Absalom to not be dead. And that's why, in every instance in this text, anytime a messenger shows, the only question he has for them is it well with the young man Absalom? Keep reading, verse 28. Ahimaaz called and said to the king, "All is well." He prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. And he said, "Blessed is the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who lifted their hands against my lord the king." And the king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. And behold, the Cushite arrived, and the Cushite said, "Let my lord the king receive good news, for the Lord has freed you this day from the hand of all those who rose up against you." And then the king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "Let the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be as that young man." The king was deeply moved, went up to the chamber over the gate and wept, and thus he said as he walked, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." You look at how these messengers bring their news. Ahimaaz, he blesses God. He says, everybody, the men who lifted up their hands against you have been delivered up. But Ahimaaz does not tell David Absalom's fate. "I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was." Well, that's a little bit of a lie, because Ahimaaz did know what it was. He knew that Absalom was dead. He can't bring himself to tell David the news. Is he heeding Joab's warning from verse 20? Well, in any case, the king has no more use for him, stand aside over there because you don't have the news I'm looking for. And the Cushite, the Ethiopian, he brings his message. You have victory. Why do you have victory, David? Why does David have victory, according to this Cushite? Because Absalom is dead. That's what victory means, David. Now, David already knows about victory. In verse 32, he says the statement, let the enemies of the king be like that young man. Now, he doesn't actually say Absalom is dead. He implies it. And David interprets it that way. Fulfilling Yahweh's ordination to destroy Absalom. Deliverance for David means disaster for Absalom. Absalom's death was necessary. The kingdom cannot have victory without the enemies being defeated. What does it say in Psalm 2? That those who rebel against the Lord's anointed, they have a choice. They can either submit to Him or they can perish in the way. It's those who take refuge in the Lord's anointed that will be saved. It's the same thing in Psalm 3. Shatter the teeth of the wicked in their mouths, of the enemies. Well, Absalom is one of those enemies. We cannot pray, save us, unless we implicitly want to see the oppressors of the gospel destroyed too. That's a hard reality to deal with. And that's a very difficult thing for some people in our culture to swallow. Because, on the one hand, Jesus really did say, love your enemies. The Lord really does want to see all men repent and turn to the truth. What the Lord wants is for people to return and submit to Him. But the reality is not everybody's going to return and submit to Him, are they? And that's where we have a real problem. And may the Lord help us to have a realistic perspective on this. This is the logic behind so many of what we call the imprecatory psalms. The psalms that are praying for God to bring judgment and destruction on the enemies. David wrote a lot of those psalms. And yet, we see David here even struggling with that concept. There's, I think, a powerful message there. The imprecatory psalms aren't in the Bible because David was a vindictive person. They're in the Bible in spite of the fact that David himself struggled with the concept they present of God. A God who vindicates the righteous and destroys the wicked, even when sometimes the wicked might be somebody who's close to us. Might be a close friend. Might even be a family member. That's a hard thing to deal with. Now, I don't know there's difficult questions out there. I don't know the answer to the question, for instance, what happens when we get to heaven and we see people that we loved in this life didn't make it somehow. I don't know how to answer that. I assume that the Lord has more joy in store for me than that would outweigh the pain of that loss. I know that what the Lord has promised, He's promised that the sufferings of this present age are not worthy with the glory that is to be compared. Well, it's not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to follow. And I know that what Keith said at the beginning here was true. All things work together for good to those who love the Lord, but not so much for those who don't. So, that's a hard thing to deal with. It's an example of how guilt inflames grief. David weeps over this. Keith, did you have something else?
All got home. That was what the condition we all.
What is the more excellent way? Well,
Those things, that thing, automatically.
well, there you go. And we'll have more to say about David weeping for Absalom next time, but we're out of time for today, so we'll pick up next time with chapter 19 and discuss some of the other implications of David's weeping.